Hey, everybody out there, those who have been following the Ellen Greenberg case for all these years, 13 years since her death, still not properly investigated. And with us today is attorney Will Trask, who's been working with the Greenberg family to finally get a proper investigation going. Now, Will, today you met with the office of the Chester County District Attorney, whose office it was thrown to after Josh Shapiro, who was then the Attorney General, threw it over because there were some allegations that there were conflicts of interest. So it ended up in the Chester County D.A.'s office. So what happened? What conclusion did they come to? They've had it for what, over a year now?
Yeah, it's been quite a while. So they just this morning released a statement concluding their investigation. We met with them yesterday. Ultimately, what they had concluded was that they didn't uncover sufficient evidence to support finding that Ellen was murdered beyond a reasonable doubt.
But the problem was, why couldn't they uncover evidence? I mean, apparently there wasn't much that they were able to investigate. They admitted that they had limitations, didn't they?
They did. And in fact, the investigation appears to have been very limited. Their access to information notwithstanding, they certainly had access to all the information that the family had developed over the years and submitted to authorities to consider. And it doesn't appear as though they considered any of that evidence in their investigation either.
Now, they also said that they had an independent forensic expert, so-called expert, but his background was what, in criminology and in the study of insects?
Yeah, that's my understanding based on his CV. Which isn't to say he doesn't have some relevant specialty here, but I guess troublingly, the real evidence that we've propounded in this case that demonstrates, in our view, beyond a reasonable doubt that this was a murder, includes forensic medical evidence developed by forensic pathologists and neuropathologists that say, for example, Ellen was already dead when she was stabbed, that Ellen was not physically, biomechanically capable of administering all 20 of those stab wounds to herself. That is conclusive evidence of a murder. And none of that evidence was considered. And it's not clear that this expert that they've identified has a background that would make him competent to assess that evidence that we had presented.
And I guess they're saying that the evidence remains, quote, unchallenged.
Yeah, the family's evidence does. Look, we have produced a parade of experts over 13 years since this began. Every single one of them has said, this is not a suicide. This is a homicide. And the response from the city, from authorities, has been, by and large, we don't think you have standing to challenge it, or we don't think the court has the authority to overrule a discretionary finding of the medical examiner, or these people have, immunity and can't be held liable for their conduct. What we haven't seen is someone coming forward and saying, your evidence is wrong.
Well, let me back up a little bit here. Now, the Chester County DA's office, are they saying that the evidence stands as a suicide, or are they saying that it's undetermined, since they admit themselves that their own investigative techniques were limited? So their conclusion is what? That it remains a suicide in their eyes?
Well, I think it's unclear to me, and it may have been unclear to Chester County, exactly what they were tasked with doing in this case. Obviously, we have lawsuits pending in the Court of Common Pleas and now in the Supreme Court, which challenge the findings in the death certificate. And we're seeking to compel not only that the death certificate be changed to reflect Ellen's actual manner of death, but also to hold accountable the officials in the city of Philadelphia who we believe have been actively covering up the truth in her case.
But what I'm asking,
separate from that, is the Chester County investigation, and it's unclear to me exactly what they were hoping to accomplish from their investigation. Their press release and the conversations that we have had with them suggest that the sole purview of that office was to determine whether or not they ought to open a murder investigation to prosecute a murderer. And the conclusion of their investigation was, well, we just don't see enough evidence to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a murder here, while acknowledging that until they open such an investigation, they don't have the authority to issue subpoenas and conduct a fulsome investigation that would be warranted in a murder investigation. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, and I'm not entirely sure what they viewed as their role. I just see, the result is unsurprising given how limited ultimately the investigation was.
Yeah, I mean, they're also at the same time they're acknowledging that their tools of investigation were limited. So that in itself is a contradiction, if not an absurdity, correct?
Well, it certainly boggles the mind that they would say we had no evidence, we could find no evidence to support a finding that Ellen was murdered. And when we presented them with evidence in our meeting, we suggested, what about this expert's conclusion and report based on the study of the depth and angle of all of the various, the 20 stab wounds that Ellen suffered? And what about these other medical experts who have said that one of the stab wounds, the one preserved in her neck, was administered post-mortem? Those are conclusive evidence of murder. What have you done to discredit those? And they acknowledged that they didn't consider that. They didn't review it.
Yeah, so therefore their conclusion doesn't hold water, correct? I mean, how could they conclude that while at the same time conceding that they didn't have the proper investigatory tools to make a proper judgment?
Yeah, I don't disagree with you.
So where does it go from here? Now it was kicked over to them. So this ends it in terms of official investigations?
Well, as I understand the release and our discussions, they acknowledge that murder has no statute of limitations. They're not closing the case. It's still open to the extent that some evidence that would meet their standard to open a homicide investigation is presented to them, but that they're no longer actively pursuing the investigation as it stands right now. So, so to answer your question, I'm not really sure. I think it sits in limbo in Chester County, given that Philadelphia is no longer able to handle it. The Attorney General's office is no longer handling it. So my sense is it'll sit there until we present them with evidence, and for a change, they actually look at it.
Now, when you brought them specifics of these discrepancies, for instance, a forensic expert, a real forensic expert, concluded that at least one of the wounds was administered post-mortem after she died. That wasn't enough for them to at least open it up to further investigation?
Well, I mean, we weren't involved in the investigation. We weren't consulted during the course of the investigation, or asked to sit with them and rebut their conclusions. I mean, we were invited to a meeting in advance of the press release to give the family an opportunity to ask questions about the release, to be given fair warning that it was coming, as a courtesy to the family. And there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue. I mean, we asked some of the questions, that I've articulated here, so I have a sense of the scope of the investigation, but it wasn't, and I don't believe was intended to be, a back and forth adversarial proceeding. I think they were there to tell us what their decision was, and we were there to hear it.
Now, their forensic expert that examined the evidence, was he on staff or was he hired?
My understanding is he's an out-of-state consultant that they hired.
So they hired a guy who had a degree in the study of insects and in criminology, and none of the type of background that a real forensic expert is expected to have.
It would appear so, although I don't know. Again, they weren't as they conceded, they weren't looking specifically at the medical evidence that we had presented to authorities. They were kind of doing their own investigation. I mean, I think it's clear from the release that they wanted to look at some things that hadn't been looked at before, and they did their own investigation. I don't know what prompted them to retain the services of an entomologist. We don't have any more detail about his involvement than that that he was their expert that they relied on. So I can't really get into, I unfortunately just don't have enough background to give you the specifics.
Were they specific about what evidence they did examine?
No, they gave some examples. I mean, they gave some examples of visiting the apartment complex, another apartment within the complex to take some measurements so that they could record for posterity, a 3D rendering of the apartment. They said they conducted some interviews, although they didn't say who the interviews were with. They said they reviewed the police file and the MEO file in the underlying case. Although in our litigation, our civil lawsuit, we've I think at this point demonstrated that some of that evidence was fabricated by police, which is what prompted that suit.
Do you have access to all the details of what they investigated and what they concluded? I mean, this sounds like a generalization of their investigation. So can you specifically find out how they investigated this and their specific conclusions, or is it just left general?
We can ask. I don't know to what extent some of their internal investigative materials would be privileged versus something that they'd be willing to provide to us. I know they had said that they would provide us with some information, but I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not sure that it matters too much. I mean, the decision here doesn't have any impact ultimately on what's happening in court. It doesn't have any impact on the Greenbergs other than emotionally. They didn't find evidence of murder because they didn't look at the evidence of murder. I mean, I don't know what else we need to get from them. I think we thank them for their efforts and move on.
Well, Attorney Trask, let me ask you this. I know as a lawyer on this case, you have to answer this very delicately, but does this indicate to you that this was just another example of officials not wanting to deal with this, just sloughing it off, and really not giving it a serious examination? Yet another example of an improper, incompetent, incomplete investigation, and this just adds to that. Is that the impression you get?
Well, I mean, it's certainly my impression that officials at every level who have looked at this case have not given it the attention it deserves, have not engaged in a good faith examination of the evidence. Because every expert we've talked to has come to the opposite conclusion, right? Guy DeAndrea, who was a homicide prosecutor in the district attorney's office, back in 2015, did his own independent investigation of all these facts, many of which were not reviewed by the Chester County district attorney, and he came to the opposite conclusion, that this was murder. And he's been very forthright about that. So, I don't want to speculate as to what the motivations are here, and whose motivations those are, but everything I've seen is that when an independent, disinterested scientist looks at this case, they conclude uniformly that this is not a suicide. And why we can't get the same consideration from any of the state or local authorities, I'd be speculating. I don't know.
Okay, Attorney Trask, so where does it go from here? There are two cases. One is before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to determine whether Ellen Greenberg's parents have standing to overturn the medical examiner's finding that it was a suicide. And the other case is you're suing officials who investigated the case accusing them of a conspiracy to cover up a murder. So those two cases are pending. What hope do you have for those to finally uncover the truth?
We're hopeful. I mean, I think we're right in both cases. Um, rather than fight us on the facts, fight us on the evidence of murder, the city's taken the tack of fighting us on sort of collateral grounds. The standing issue, being an example of that in the state Supreme Court. We're hopeful that when the Supreme Court reviews our case, they're going to conclude that Sandy and Josh have standing to pursue this case against the city on behalf of their daughter as administrators of her estate. I think a contrary conclusion would be absurd, as the trial court pointed out. If not them, who? Right? Same goes for the ongoing case in common pleas court and the trial court. That case has been briefed for summary judgment, meaning that the city and the individual defendants have asked that this case be thrown out before trial on the ground that all of those defendants ought to be immune from liability in this case because they were high officials of a government authority. Again, we believe that the immunity doesn't apply in this case, that these people were actively involved in a crime, in covering up a murder, and that they ought not be given immunity. And that's scheduled to be argued before a judge next month.
So wrapping up now, Attorney Trask, do you feel that you have made more progress than has been the case, and that you have more of a chance now of really getting to the bottom of what happened to Ellen Greenberg 13 years ago?
We do. We've been very fortunate in legal rulings in the lawsuits where the judges have seen this case from the same perspective as the family and have made it possible for us to review a lot of evidence from the police files and the MEO files and all these documents that had been withheld from the family for 13 years. So we have made a lot of headway. I think at this point, we have the facts and the evidence to establish without any doubt that Ellen Greenberg was murdered. The only thing that's left is giving us a forum to make that argument to a jury of the Greenberg's peers, rather than being thrown out and swept under the rug. And so that's what we hope to achieve.
Attorney Will Trask, thanks very much for the update on the ongoing investigation or the non-investigation so far of Ellen Greenberg's death. Will, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks, Larry.